Certo. Então, estamos aqui iniciando a transmissão, né, e eu aproveito, então, para apresentar o Oliver, né? O Oliver Prest é filósofo e pesquisador em literatura e cultura, é pesquisador, como eu já falei, do Leibniz-Zentrum für Literatur und Kulturforschung, ZFL, em Berlim, onde integra o grupo de pesquisa em História da Teoria e coordena o projeto Marx na França, a autodeterminação da teoria francesa. Oliver também é pesquisador associado do Santo Marco Bloch, desde 2022, e lidera, junto comigo, o projeto Paradoxos da Emancipação, né? Sua pesquisa explora filosofia política, teoria crítica, literatura e estudos culturais, com foco em autores como Merleau-Ponty, Derrida, Heidegger. Destaca o seu livro Der rote Faden, Maurice Merleau-Ponty und die Politik der Wahrnehmung, né? O fio vermelho, Maurice Merleau-Ponty e a política da percepção, que discute esse conceito importante, desenvolvido por ele, que é da política da percepção. Além disso, ele organiza, junto comigo e com Andreas Lipovski, você vê que eu esqueço o nome da pessoa que organiza comigo o livro. O livro de Ontologische Wende, Indigene Kosmologie und die Dekolonisierung des Seins, né? A virada ontológica, cosmologias indígenas e a descolonização do ser, a ser publicado pela Surkamp. Por fim, também cabe destacar que ele está escrevendo um livro sobre Clarice Lispector, chamado Tropic Writing in the Climate of Dictatorship, né? A ser publicado pela Mattes Seitz, né? Uma editora também lá da Alemanha. Então, eu aproveito e passo a palavra para o Oliver.
Does this work? Can you all hear me? Yeah. Muito obrigado, Bernardo, pela apresentação. Perfeito. Antes de começar, gostaria de agradecer também a todos e todas que nos apoiaram na organização e no financiamento deste colóquio. E também gostaria de agradecer a todas e todos os participantes e a todos que vieram discutir conosco hoje. Agora mudarei para o idioma do seu not so friendly neighbor, e mais tarde, durante a palestra, uma tradução para o português será projetada atrás de mim. Talking about which, as you all know, this conference is, among many other things, also an experiment in intercultural dialogue, which is kind of ironic, because the very topic of this conference radically challenges the idea of multiculturalism. On a practical level, this will mean that most of the talks, hopefully all of the talks, will be accompanied by a translation in Portuguese or English, respectively. Some of you already provided us with these translations, and we are very grateful for that. Some others we did ourselves, which gave us the opportunity to familiarize ourselves in advance with your thoughts and concepts. The idea of this experiment is that everyone can take part in the discussion, ask questions in whatever language they feel most comfortable with. We will then try to translate. Tá, claro, pode.
Só para explicar, não precisa do microfone, não.
Pode.
Só para explicar, né? Então, essa é uma coisa muito importante que eu deixei de falar, que é o fato de que as falas que não forem, né, em português, na verdade, bom, as falas que não são em português, elas serão acompanhadas por um texto. Eu sei, mas é que ele falou isso em inglês, eu só estou repetindo. Então, desculpa, gente, eu vou repetir então o que eu estava falando aqui agora. Só para explicar então a dinâmica, né? É que as falas são acompanhadas sempre por um texto de tradução, tá? Então, assim, no caso de falas em inglês, elas serão acompanhadas por uma tradução para o português. E quando forem falas em inglês, quando forem falas em português, elas serão acompanhadas por um texto em inglês atrás, tá? Só para garantir a inteligibilidade do que está sendo tratado aqui, tá? É só isso que eu queria esclarecer a respeito da fala do Oliver agora.
Well, speaking just for myself, making these translations, I've made use of the latest translation technology, namely DeepL, which I then revised. I really think that DeepL is one of the greatest tools ever invented. I'd say it's really a beautiful thing. Still, the result is maybe somewhat rustic, but the quality should be quite a bit better than what you usually get from simultaneous interpretation. In any case, whenever you read something that doesn't make sense, the blame is on me, whereas everything smart and enlightening is entirely the work of the speakers. All things considered, I think that the multicultural translations between modern languages such as Portuguese, Spanish, English or German are quite a minor task compared to the far more abysmal type of multinatural translations between worlds that we are concerned with in this conference. The difference between these two types of translations is more than just a theoretical construction. I think it's a very real thing. Let me try to illustrate this very briefly with an example from my own experience. Last year, I had the pleasure and honor to participate in an event with the great Yanomami shaman and indigenous political leader Davi Kopenawa, whose name I'm sure all of you are familiar with. Our attempt at having a conversation, maybe even a dialogue, was not exactly an easy task. First, there was a sort of intercultural dimension to the problem. As you probably know, Davi speaks some Portuguese. It is a sort of very direct and somewhat simplified Portuguese, which, as is very important to understand, is not due to a lack of intelligence or something like that. Rather, it is due to a certain ideal of rhetoric that he also lays out in his book. He does not speak at all like a child, but like someone with a very clear idea of the effects his discourse is supposed to produce. So obviously, this already produced a lot of rather difficult problems, namely finding the right tone, transporting his direct and unapologetic style without making him sound like a child. There were also some more or less grave problems with the vocabulary, problems that are quite familiar to everyone who has ever attempted to translate texts from Romance languages to German or English. For example, Davi used the word espíritus when he talked about the chapiris, entities that are central to the Yanomami cosmology. And of course, we could have a long debate on whether to translate espíritu as ghost, spirit, specter, demon, and so on. And I think these are also serious problems, but they pale in contrast to the truly mind-boggling problem of multinatural translation that Davi himself was confronted with all the time. Moving from espíritu to spirit is a walk in the park. You can stroll comfortably, point to some signs placed along the way which explain a bunch of well-known facts about European intellectual history, about the history of the concept spirit, for example, how it was used in philosophy, theology, or anthropology, about its Latin origins, and so on. Moving from chapiri to espiritu, on the other hand, is an expedition through unknown territory. The amount of commentary necessary to get even just a rough idea of the meaning of this concept is quite astonishing. And what's even worse, there's very little previous research you can rely on. It took Davi and his friend, the French anthropologist Bruce Albert, more than 20 years and more than 1,000 pages to explain what is going on in this translation. And I think that the difference between these two exercises in translation is so great that it ceases to be a merely quantitative difference. And as soon as we acknowledge this difference, we can at least admit that the ontological turn is a serious attempt at making sense of it, even if we do not agree with its central concepts or with its politics. I will now slowly move from these preliminary remarks to my actual talk, and I want to start by trying to situate my talk very briefly in the context of our research. This conference is, as most of you know, and as Bernardo already mentioned, part of a larger research project with the title Paradoxes of Emancipation, a collaboration between the Centre Marc Bloch in Berlin and the USP. Within this framework, we have hosted a number of conferences, workshops, lectures, and research stays that try to tackle the recent crisis of democracy in Brazil, which is closely related to similar phenomena all over Latin America, as well as in Europe, in the United States, and in many other places around the world. At first, we were particularly interested in post-truth, a strange phenomenon that seems to be everywhere, but at the same time nowhere, in the sense that it is very hard to grasp. Nobody doubts that it exists, but nobody can quite say what it is. On many occasions, we discuss the emergence, the dynamics, the key actors, oftentimes individuals and groups from the far right, as well as the catastrophic consequences of this new phenomenon. Most importantly, maybe, we discuss the inability of most, maybe even all, emancipatory projects to meet this new challenge. In what follows, I will use the question of post-truth as a starting point to develop some preliminary thoughts on the basic concepts of the so-called ontological turn in the humanities. These rather theoretical and abstract remarks are meant to serve as an input to our discussion of more concrete political phenomena. But back to post-truth. And also starting from now, you should be able to read the translation of my talk, including a few explanations in brackets. So maybe the translation will actually be more clear than the original. In my opinion, most, maybe even all of the attempts at fighting post-truth rely on the idea that the misinformation of the public, as it is usually called, can somehow be undone either by replacing the misinformation with correct information, by fact-checking the fake news, by debunking the lies and conspiracy theories, or by providing the public with a range of critical tools, by awakening in the souls of the population a critical, skeptical attitude towards the sources of fake news and towards the rhetoric of the politicians who make use of it. While this is very reasonable and maybe even necessary, I'm convinced that this is not enough. All these strategies seem to rely on a strong distinction between those who know and those who don't know, between savants and ignorance. Those who believe in fake news and conspiracy theories are seen and treated as naive or even crazy people. They are seen as lacking knowledge of the world and as lacking the skills to acquire this knowledge. So in a way, their popular image reminds us of the image of children and indigenous peoples our society entertained for a very long time. That is, as ignorance, who are in need of education and guidance by someone who isn't an ignorant, by a savant. And of course, in modern Western societies, the savant is by definition first and foremost a scientist. The scientist has the true knowledge of the world, of climate change, of the effects of extractivist practices in the Amazon, of the effects of tobacco consumption, and all the other things that are so heavily contested by fake news and conspiracy theories. This scientific knowledge, in turn, is supposed to be the stable, common ground for our society. Interestingly, fighting post-truth typically doesn't mean training the supposed ignorance in the methods of science. The government and non-government programs that try to combat post-truth don't usually focus on explaining or teaching the practice of science, on demonstrating how and why they obtain this knowledge that is so important to our society. Instead of getting citizens to actively, or at least passively by mere intellectual understanding, to participate in the production of scientific knowledge, as philosophers like Bruno Latour or Isabelle Stengers often proposed, the government and non-government programs rather try to engage the ignorance, always in quotation marks of course, in a method of the humanities. That is, in a form of Quellenkritik, of source criticism, as it was first developed to get a better understanding of classical text from antiquity, then famously applied to the Bible, and later to all types of historical, literary, musical, etc. sources. In any case, both the model of the scientist and of the humanities scholar have not proven to be very effective in combating post-truth. And I'm convinced that the reason for this, at least one important part of the reason for this, is that there is a cosmopolitical dimension to the problem. And cosmopolitics is, as you know, one of the central notions of the so-called ontological turn in the humanities. When presented as models for the citizen of modern democracies, both types of savants, the scientist as well as the humanities scholar who is engaged in source criticism, are representatives of a certain cosmopolitics. This cosmopolitics lives in a symbiotic relationship with what can be called the modern cosmology. When I use the word cosmology, I don't mean some form of implicit or explicit philosophy that all members of modern society adhere to, but rather a system of certain fundamental notions like nature, culture, freedom, work, production, reproduction, and so on, that informs what I would call big politics. By big politics, I mean something like the broad lines of modern politics, as they are conceived of, or rather imagined, in the centers of modernity. And this big politics aims, to put it in the shortest, but of course also very abbreviated way, at modernization. And modernization involves two things. First, it involves the politics of nature. It aims at a control and domination of nature that is based on an unambiguous scientific knowledge which allows us to extract the maximum of resources for our human enterprises. And modernization also involves a politics of culture, which I would describe as a hidden form of cosmopolitics. It aims at educating and guiding all other cultures which are not capable of this unambiguous scientific knowledge and therefore refrain to ineffective or irrational methods of control and extraction. Obviously, not everyone, not even most people, actively believe in this cosmology or in the possibility of gaining this kind of very exact knowledge that would allow us to control and dominate nature. Certainly many modern philosophers, scientists, and humanities scholars didn't. And also certainly many, probably most non-modern peoples didn't believe that either. Nevertheless, there are some philosophical systems, especially from the 19th century, when the belief in progress and reason was particularly strong, that come close to giving an explicit formulation of this cosmology. This is, in my opinion, especially true for positivism, and even more so for the political positivism that developed here in Brazil. Be that as it may, I think that this cosmology still informs our politics of nature, our extractivist stance towards this world, and our pedagogical attitude towards all types of ignorance, be they indigenous peoples or supposedly crazy adherents of conspiracy theories. But there's a discrepancy between this big politics, as it is imagined in the centers of modernity, in the lettered cities, as the philosopher Angel Rama would call it, and its messy and very chaotic realization. While big politics seems to, consciously or not, aim at modernizing the world, at controlling and dominating nature, at educating and guiding all non-modern peoples, the actual reality of this process of modernization, especially in the peripheries, far away from the lettered cities, has been and still is quite different from the modernist vision of modernization. The actual practices of modernization, the situated and messy realization, actually presupposes a different cosmology. Put in a different way, I would say that modernity is characterized by different cosmological formations. A dominant one, that could be called rationalist or naturalist or simply modern, which informs the big politics of modernization, and then a multiplicity of hybrid syncretist systems that support many, maybe even most of the actual practices of modernization. From the perspective of the rationalist cosmology, all cultural practices and all cultures are understood as attempts to calculate, control, and dominate nature. Ideally, our political decisions and everyone else's should be based on an unambiguous scientific knowledge of nature, which would allow us to control and dominate nature in the most effective fashion. And it also informs our cosmopolitics, by which I mean our political relations towards all forms of non-modern cosmologies, towards their ways of inhabiting the planet and their very own cosmopolitics. And the main problem with our cosmopolitics, the problem that increasingly comes to light in the present, and I will try to say why it comes to light, especially now, towards the end of my talk. The problem is that it denies the political character of these relations. It turns the political relations to non-modern peoples and groups into merely pedagogical ones. Or more precisely, it obscures their political character by pretending the relation is merely pedagogical. What does pedagogical mean in this case? Let's take an interesting example. It is a classic, probably even the classic example from the formative period of modernity. When the so-called explorers came to America, they were confronted with indigenous cultures that were not only difficult to dominate, control, and convert, but also challenged their very own ideas of culture, nature, and politics. They expected to find peoples who believed in a different God, but who at least believed in the same way, who therefore had a cultural identity in the same sense as the Europeans, and defended this cultural identity in the same way. As Eduardo Viveros de Castro showed in his famous essay on the inconsistency of the wild soul, many of the indigenous peoples had no concept of faith or cultural identity, and therefore also no interest in defending this identity. Unlike other pagans encountered in the ancient world, they did not believe in a supernatural being who enabled humans to establish a realm of culture within the more or less stable natural world. Consequently, there was also no entity to tell them, this is how you should cultivate your land and your minds. This is the right way to organize society, to eat, to hunt, to pray, and so on. So there was no competition between the gods, and therefore also no competition between the cultures, at least if culture is understood as an identity, as a set of beliefs about the right way to cultivate nature. But of course, the fact that these cultures had no, or at least very little interest in defending their identity, didn't mean that they had no interest at all. Of course they did. They had differing, often antagonistic political interests. They had very different societies that implied very different cosmologies, different politics, and different cosmopolitics. But from the perspective of the colonizers who couldn't and also didn't want to make sense of this difference, it appeared that they had no culture and no political interests at all. There seemed to be no political adversary, no political conflict that would require some sort of diplomacy. Instead, all they saw was merely pre-political, almost childlike interests in satisfying their immediate needs. They appeared to have no beliefs and no culture, but only some unreflected bad habits that called for education and guidance. The official cosmopolitics, the relation between the dawning modern world and the many non-modern worlds of the Americas, increasingly took on the form of pedagogy. The indigenous peoples were treated not like enemies that believed in the wrong God, that had the wrong culture, not like something evil, but rather as innocent children in need of benevolent guidance. However well-meaning this guidance may have been, it often required very brutal methods, especially the separation of children from their families, in order to remove them from the bad influence, the bad habits of their parents. These attempts at cultivating the minds of the indigenous populations, as well as the large-scale attempts at cultivating the vast lands of the Americas, required a strong belief in our own ability to understand human and non-human nature. It required a belief in science as the privileged cultural practice that provides this understanding. An understanding that can oversee the consequences of our actions, our interventions in said human and non-human nature. The actual experience of attempting to cultivate on a large scale both the minds and the land constantly challenged this belief and provided rich material for the insight that we are unable to fully grasp the consequences of our politics of nature and our pedagogical politics of culture. The monocultures that were planted after the first waves of deforestations would eventually degrade the soil, much like the entire fossil industry will eventually degrade the climatic conditions and even reduce the overall extraction of resources. And on a local level, since the very earliest day of the colonization of the Americas, there have been many, countless practices that did not adhere to this extractivist paradigm of controlling and dominating nature, that worked in a much more sustainable way. This obviously didn't stop the big politics of deforestation and extraction, as we can witness to this very day in Amazonia and in many other parts of the Americas. When it comes to the politics of culture, to the covered and unacknowledged cosmopolitics, the case is more complicated. But I think it is still fair to say that on a local level, there have been instances of practices that didn't adhere to the big politics of education and guidance. In some cases, the colonizers and missionaries came to the realization that their strategy didn't work, that the indigenous didn't respond to their identity politics,
or that it worked too well, that their attempts at converting them, at saving their souls, actually produced mental, social, and physical devastation. That's why in some cases, very interesting cases in my opinion, something else happened, something that we would maybe describe in terms of syncretism or mutual entanglement. And I think that the so-called ontological turn is actually something like a prolongation or a radicalization of these local and dissident practices. It is not something entirely new, not a sudden and complete revolution brought about by a few humanities scholars of the late 20th and early 21st century. But to see in what sense it is part of a longer history, it is important to understand the basic conceptual operations that were at work in the educational paradigm as well as in the deviation therefrom. If you start to delve into the almost infinite literature on the encounter between the old and new world, you will find many texts that describe first contact as dominated by a form of exoticism. The basic idea, which is repeated in many variations, is that the colonizers and missionaries somehow saw and portrayed the indigenous peoples they encountered as something completely other, completely foreign, as inhuman cannibals, as wild animals, and so forth. Many other authors, myself included, think that the core of this so-called exoticism is not an othering, but on the contrary an act of appropriation, of familiarization. Anthony Pacton, for example, who in my opinion wrote one of the best books on the encounter with the New World, titled European Encounters with the New World, published in 1993 with Yale University Press, stated that, I quote, and I think this will remain the only quote in the talk, "Our eyes and our scientific understanding move from the known to the unknown, not the other way." What does this mean? The first reaction to the shock of the encounter with the New World consists in seeing it, in perceiving it as something familiar. So there is an unspoken and largely unconscious politics of perception at work. And this perception almost immediately leads to naming the other something. And even if it is a somewhat horrific name like cannibal, savage, animal, or even monster, this act of naming is not an othering, but a familiarization, an appropriation. And the perceptual and linguistic operation is only the first step towards more tangible forms of appropriation, like education, conversion, absorption into the emerging capitalist economy, and blatant slavery. So in the first encounter, the New World is new only in a very particular sense. It is not completely different. It is not a completely different, absolutely other world in the sense of the ontological turn, which frequently talks of multiple worlds, of a pluriverse that contains radically different worlds, but rather in the sense that it is a clean slate that allows for the projection of the hopes and fears of the old world. It is something like an idealized double of the old world, so not very new. And the true progress, not in the sense of big politics that tries to subject the entire world to the same regime, but true progress in diplomacy and in understanding, consists in a move from the known to the unknown, in a process of defamiliarization, or even othering. It is important, however, that the subject of this othering, or defamiliarization, is not the self, but the other. So true progress isn't just replacing the old appropriating images with new othering ones, which would still be an activity of and by the self, but allowing the new world to actively change our images and ideas of it, allowing the other to somehow other ourselves. And that is, by the way, in my opinion, the deeper meaning of the syncretist practices I mentioned. They do not consist, at least not in the most interesting cases, in simply blending differences, but in a dialogue between cultures, or rather worlds. In any case, the manifold and not very straightforward process of defamiliarization constitutes a kind of counter-tradition that stretches from very early encounters that are reflected, for example, in texts by Montaigne, by Jean de Lery, or even by some of the Jesuit missionaries, all the way to some of the core texts of the anthropological strain of the ontological turn. for example by Tania Stolze Lima, Eduardo Viveros de Castro, Marisol de la Cadena, or Philippe Descola. The process of defamiliarization is always double. It is first and foremost a renewed encounter with the actual other. But this encounter also requires, or at least goes hand in hand, with a constant self-critique of modern cosmology, which again, at least for me, means nothing but the conceptual framework that informs and supports big politics. That is, the modernizing project of extracting resources and educating non-modern folks. This double process of an actual encounter with the other and a corresponding self-critique that prepares us and opens up the space for this encounter is quite clearly mirrored in the history of the ontological turn. The cosmopolitical encounter with the other that was attempted by the anthropologist strain of this discursive formation was accompanied by a radical self-critique of the scientific practices that make up the core of our own cosmology and cosmopolitics. Isabel Stengers, Bruno Latour, and many others have called into question the unspoken claim of science to provide unambiguous and comprehensive knowledge of the world. And once again, they have done so on the basis of the actual practice of science, which is far messier and aleatoric than the vision of big politics would like it to be. And while the encounters with the non-modern other frequently led to a very radical questioning of the modern practice of knowledge production, the science and technology studies invariably lead to the question of the encounter with the non-modern other, so they kind of meet in the middle. As Isabel Stengers put it at the very end of her 7 volumes on cosmopolitics, science, as the prototypical modern practice, can only know what it really wants, which risks it is willing to take, what obligations it is committing itself to, through its very own practice, and that is by facing its most difficult test, the encounter with the non-moderns. Summing up, I would argue that the ontological turn consists of 2 strains. First, an anthropological strain that can be traced back not just to the British, French, and US-American traditions of anthropology, but to an entire tradition that produced knowledge about the other through alterations, through a process of defamiliarization, whose actual real subject is not the anthropologist, but rather his object of study, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and of course of many other regions too. Second, a tradition of self-critique that tackles the imaginary role of science in and for modern cosmology and cosmopolitics. That is, for the political, or rather pedagogical relations modernity entertains to non-modern peoples and their cosmologies. Of course, the formation of a discourse like the ontological turn follows its own logic. It depends on developments that are particular to the respective fields of research. But at the same time, we can also understand it as a reaction to certain major developments of world history that pose new challenges to our modern cosmology and the corresponding cosmopolitics. This is especially true for the catastrophic changes of the planetary system. I don't want to say that the entire discourse is merely an effect of climate change, but it is also no coincidence that climate change is one of the central themes and one of the fields where the notions of this discourse are most productive, much like in the case of post-truth, to which I tried to apply these concepts at the beginning of my talk. I would like to end with an observation rather than a conclusion. The limits, the situatedness, and even the provinciality of our modern cosmology seem to become evident in moments in which the impossibility of a domination of nature becomes apparent. The first time that, at least in my opinion, the universality not just of our values or our mode of production, but of our ontology as such, was radically put in question, coincided with the shock of the first nuclear bombs. In the aftermath of the Second World War, and during the phase of the Cold War, the first phase of the Cold War, Heidegger famously stated that we as Westerners live in a different house of being, as he called it, than, for example, the Japanese, implying that we don't just understand being differently, but live in different worlds. And he came to that conclusion because of, or at least at the same time as he witnessed the global spread of a big politics that resulted from, or at least was informed by, the modern Western ontology. Although Heidegger had absolutely nothing to offer in terms of solving it, he sensed the problem that this big politics is not just destroying the environment, but rather is itself founded on an illusionary notion of nature as a stable background. And this stable background of nature, to use a phrase of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who I consider the most profound predecessor of the ontological turn, has become explosive. Not just the technology, but the very concept of nature that the development of modern technologies was based on is becoming explosive. And it is the very same sentiment of an explosive nature that constitutes the background, or rather the environment, in which this entire discourse of the ontological turn flourished. Thank you very much for your attention. How are we going to do this? Shall we have a quick Q&A, or shall we do the? Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think the idea was that if you have like questions that are directly addressing my talk, there will be like a few minutes now to post them, and then we will listen to the other talks, and at the end of the session we will have more time for a more general discussion. So, but if you have any questions concerning what I just said, then you can. But maybe we will need a microphone in order for the people on YouTube to. Because it's on YouTube, so the people won't be able to hear.
Okay, can we hear? Yeah? Okay, thank you so much. That was a great way to start, and I learned so much. And then I was struck by a phrase towards the end when you were talking about allowing the other to other ourselves. And I was thinking how one could have almost found that phrase in Hegel. And I don't think that's where you're going. I don't think you want a sort of dialectical resolution here. But I wonder if you can clarify how the solution, as you say, that Heidegger doesn't give us a solution. How does your other, allowing the other to other the self, not come back to a Hegelian synthesis? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This is a yeah. I mean, maybe the most difficult question. I think it comes down to. I think in hindsight, you can always find a dialectical formulation for these things. But I think it's a cheap trick. Like, and especially the problem with this. I mean, this is also not a very interesting concept of dialectics. I think if you frame it that way. But the problem is that, I mean, in hindsight, you could maybe always find a way to say that what you have learned from the other was somehow always present already in the self. You can do that, but the problem is if you start thinking like that, that will make it very difficult for you to have actual encounters. So I think there's more a political question in the end. On a theoretical level, I think it cannot be solved. So it's more like, I think, the phrases like the one that you just quoted, I think they're more like of practical use. Yeah, I hope that kind of. I mean, there's so much to be said about this, but I think we want to keep this a bit short now. But yeah.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I was thinking exactly something like that in the direction of practices. For example, when you talk about fake news and people that, I don't know, are radicalized and think differently, and it has a kind of non-understandability about their position. There is a German philosopher, Eva von Heidecke. She wrote a book called Praxis and Revolution. And there she talks about when we start to get this kind of effect of non-intelligibility is because people are actually immersed in other contexts of practices. We can't understand them because they are doing something different. It's not that they are thinking something different, but because they are doing something different. Would you agree with that, or you see it in a more epistemic way?
That's a very good question. I think that this is I think in a way this is still a bit idealistic, but in general I would agree with the direction. I mean, because if you think that it will merely come down to involving those, like say, adherents of conspiracy theories into our practices, that makes it sound very simple, but it will not be very simple, because the question will remain: how will you be able to convince them to do that? And this question, I think, can only be solved, can even only be addressed when you really see how drastic the problem is. And I think this whole like talk about different worlds and stuff like that, this is just political rhetoric, you know. Like I just want to, like, when I try to apply these concepts to these very dramatic problems that we're facing now, all Western democracies, it is just to point out how difficult the problem is. So, and I think when you just like, I think Eva is a bit idealistic in the sense, which also comes from her own practice. She lives on a farm, and on small scale, many things can be resolved just by doing stuff. But on the big scale of big politics, as I was talking about, this is very complicated, because we are not living in small communities, and we need complex strategies. But on a theoretical level, I would say, of course, like if we manage to like involve everyone, the entire population, at least intellectually, in the production of the science that they are criticizing, yeah, that's kind of the solution. But how do you do that? And I think, to point out this political problem, it is important to not simplify it. I hope that kind of half answers the question. And of course, everyone's free to ask questions in Portuguese too, and we try to translate it. But yeah. What is? Yeah. Of course. Yeah. Then, no, who was second? Aline. Okay.
Então, gente, prosseguindo com as apresentações, agora a gente vai ouvir a professora Aline Costa, uma destacada filósofa contemporânea. A Aline é professora do Departamento de Filosofia da PUC Rio, onde também colidera o grupo de pesquisa Terrâneas. Eu fiquei na dúvida. Okay. Núcleo Transdisciplinar de Pensamento Ecológico. A Aline é mestre e doutora em filosofia pela PUC Rio, com doutorado sanduíche pela Universidade de Paris-Nanterre. Atualmente, você realiza esse pós-doutorado ainda? Não, já acabou o pós-doutorado que eu tinha anotado aqui. Sua obra foca na filosofia ambiental, com ênfase no antropoceno, cosmopolítica e perspectivas não ocidentais. Destaco sua tese premiada Cosmopolíticas da Terra, Modos de Existência e Resistência no Antropoceno, de 2019, vencedora do Prêmio CAPES de Tese 2020. E o livro Guerra e Paz no Antropoceno, uma análise da crise ecológica, segundo a obra de Bruno Latour, de 2017. Então, passo a palavra para a Aline. Vou colocar o texto.
Olá, bom dia. Vocês me ouvem bem? Para a gravação tá bom também? Bom, gente, então queria começar agradecendo muitíssimo o convite para estar aqui novamente com o Oliver e com o Bernardo, né, segundo evento no âmbito do projeto que eu estou participando, então é uma alegria. E fico muito feliz de estar nessa mesa e falar, depois da fala do Oliver, que vai ter muita ressonância, ainda que eu não vá falar muito diretamente especificamente de pós-verdade, né, dos problemas democráticos que a gente enfrenta, né, muito especificamente, de forma muito crucial ultimamente. Acho que tem como a gente puxar também da minha fala essas questões e, na conversa, claro, isso vai ficar um pouco mais claro também, né? Bom, então eu vou falar, né, claramente eu estou falando em português, né? Dá para detectar, pois é, né? Mas aí, então, uma tradução da minha fala vai ser aqui providenciada, tá? Bom, então, o título é Ontologia Política e os Desafios da Mutualidade. Uma questão que tem recebido cada vez mais atenção no campo das chamadas humanidades ambientais é o que poderíamos chamar de uma investigação sobre o estatuto ontológico da Terra ou mesmo dos seus modos de existência. No plural, né, modos de existência, porque a Terra pode muito bem ser a única que nós temos, mas ela não tem se comportado do mesmo jeito, não tem sido a mesma ao longo da sua história, né? Nem na relação que os seres que a compõem e habitam estabelecem com essa Terra. Essa é uma das descobertas mais marcantes dessa nova época geológica, que, apesar de ser chamada de antropoceno, talvez seja melhor entendida como a época da Terra. Ou seja, a época em que a Terra deixa de ser um mero cenário e passa a ser o centro das preocupações de todos os seus habitantes, explícita ou implicitamente, para o bem e para o mal, né? Políticas negacionistas estão aí para a gente perceber isso. E esse reconhecimento impõe uma série de dificuldades e exigências. Uma dessas dificuldades diz respeito a novos problemas impostos à relação entre o uno e o múltiplo, que podem ser sintetizados da seguinte forma. Por um lado, precisamos reconhecer a legitimidade dos mundos vividos e concebidos pelos povos extramodernos, mundos que divergem em aspectos importantes do chamado ocidental. Por outro lado, não podemos ignorar o fato de que esses povos também estão, como todos os outros seres viventes da Terra, enfrentando o mesmo colapso ecológico de dimensão global, mesmo entre aspas, né? Porque há maneiras muito distintas de falar dessa catástrofe. A questão se impõe porque, justamente quando o ideal do universalismo parecia ter perdido muito do seu prestígio nas ciências humanas, o antropoceno ameaça trazê-lo de volta à cena. O fato de a catástrofe ecológica em curso ser global implicaria a indestrutibilidade epistêmica da categoria do universal? O que se torna a ontologia política, entendida, veremos a seguir, como a necessidade de instaurar um mundo em que cabem muitos mundos, né, o célebre slogan zapatista, o que se torna ontologia política diante da evidência onipresente dessa catástrofe? Junto com a dificuldade de entender os contornos desse global, vem, portanto, uma exigência que tal investigação se comprometa com a defesa da autodeterminação ontológica dos povos extramodernos. Algumas palavras, então, a respeito desse pluralismo ontológico que condiciona a nossa investigação do global. Ao longo dos últimos 30 anos, né, Oliver já falou um pouco sobre isso, a noção de ontologia, que possui uma história longa e respeitada na área da filosofia, vem sendo mobilizada em teorias e análises oriundas de campos de conhecimento outros que a filosofia, ainda que frequentemente em diálogo estreito com ela. A área do saber que capitaneou esse movimento foi a antropologia, cuja virada ontológica está ligada ao trabalho de autoras como Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, Marilyn Straturner, Roy Wagner, Felipe Scolar e Bruno Latour. Essa lista varia, né? Falam de um narrow turn, um broad turn, mas, né, vamos falar assim. Se historicamente os estudos antropológicos se deram em torno do conceito de cultura, conceito que, por sua vez, pode ser associado à Revolução Copernicana, né, provocada na filosofia por Immanuel Kant, a qual teria instaurado um abismo intransponível entre ontologia e epistemologia, ou entre mundo e representação, né? Então, se historicamente os estudos se centravam no conceito de cultura, a virada ontológica da antropologia expressa o compromisso de tornar o conjunto de seres, temporalidades, espacialidades, relações e práticas que integram os modos de vida dos nativos como conformando realidades legítimas no plural e não como meras representações culturais. Nesse movimento, os parâmetros por meio dos quais muitos costumavam distribuir os entes que constituem a realidade, parâmetros que, aos olhos dos ditos ocidentais, pareciam possuir validade universal, né, como os que informam a oposição natureza-cultura, tal como ela se estabeleceu na modernidade europeia, esses parâmetros aparecem como regionalizados, isto é, como especificidades de um modo de vida que não desfruta de privilégio ontológico em relação a outros modos de vida. Há, então, como podemos ver, um componente fortemente político nesse giro da antropologia à ontologia. Mais precisamente, tal movimento pressupõe e reafirma uma articulação indissociável entre ontologia e política, por meio da qual a ontologia passa a ser vista como expressão de uma certa... A política passa a ser vista como expressão de uma certa ontologia, já que pressupostos ontológicos circunscrevem tal prática, informando o que pode ou não pode contar como política e quais seres ou não podem ser considerados agentes políticos, Correlatamente, a ontologia aparece como política, na medida em que determinar o que conta ou não como real provém de decisões, mais do que revelações ou meras constatações. Assim sendo, se mostram passíveis de questionamento e revisão. Por exemplo, Viveiros de Castro afirma mobilizar em seus escritos a ontologia como máquina de guerra filosófica, cito o Viveiros de Castro, né? Máquina de guerra filosófica, tanto antiepistemológica quanto contracultural, em ambos os sentidos do termo contracultura. Fim da citação. Né? Já para Marisol de la Cadena, a antropologia orientada para uma abertura ontológica, ou abertura ontoepistêmica, como ela prefere falar, né? Ela recusa um pouco a ideia de giro ontológico, permite situar a política moderna, combatendo sua hegemonia ao denunciar suas pretensões universalistas. Ainda, segundo autores como Eduardo Kohn, Elisabeth Povinelli e Bjorn Bertensen e Bendisen, né, a virada ontológica consistiu numa resposta a problemas e contradições conceituais que emergem quando as bases humanistas da antropologia são desafiadas pela crise ecológica que marca o antropoceno. Né? E aí dá para falar um pouco, então, de 3 dimensões da ontologia que o Mário Blaser, né, se apropria para falar da ideia de... isso não está aqui, eu acho. Bom, mas rapidamente, né? 3 dimensões da ontologia que o Mário Blaser descreve para situar a sua noção de política ontológica. Né? Pressuposições sobre quem e o que existe, né? Condições de existência e relações de dependência, uma espécie de inventário sobre que tipos de seres e relações existem. Né? O outro princípio, né? Ontologias e mundos são sinônimos, pois as primeiras são moldadas por práticas, não ideias, né? Ou não apenas ideias, e interações mundanas. E a terceira seria a dimensão narrativa, ontologias como ativações totais de mundos envolvendo aspectos discursivos e não discursivos. Né? Então, a ontologia política, por um lado, refere-se à política envolvida nas práticas que moldam um determinado mundo ou ontologia. Por outro, refere-se a um campo de estudo que se concentra nos conflitos que surgem à medida que mundos ou ontologias diferentes se confrontam. Tá? São parênteses que acho que não está nessa versão aqui. Bom, as definições e reivindicações que acabo de mencionar ajudam a esclarecer as condições dessa articulação entre ontologia e política. No artigo The Challenge of Ontological Politics, chegamos lá, a filósofa Isabelle Stangers afirma que o desafio mencionado no título consiste em tomar partido, né, por alguns sentidos, tanto de política quanto de ontologia, e não por outros. Fim da citação. O sentido de política a que Stangers se refere, associado ao que ela chama de arte da diplomacia, aponta para um conceito familiar a quem acompanha seu trabalho, que o Oliver também já falou, o de cosmopolítica, que caracterizarei aqui, correndo o risco de não expressar todas as suas nuances, como uma aposta especulativa de que a política pode proceder de modo a levar a sério a objeção daqueles que sofrerão as consequências das decisões, mesmo que eles não façam parte da deliberação. Isso implica que os participantes podem ser capazes de abrir mão das certezas que lhes asseguram que as preocupações dos outros não importam tanto, diante da gravidade da questão e da urgência da decisão que precisa ser tomada. Porém, quando se trata de ontologia política, diz Stangers, a cosmopolítica é profundamente limitada. Isso porque esse conceito foi pensado para situações em que diferentes interessados estão envolvidos em torno de uma causa, ainda que não necessariamente eles estejam envolvidos diretamente, podendo falar, podendo se expressar. Porém, quando apenas os outros se preocupam com uma situação que envolve sujeitos outros que humanos, aos quais se sentem vinculados, digamos, por exemplo, os medos que os Quichua, habitantes de Pachanta, um vilarejo nas cercanias de Cusco, no Peru, o medo que esses habitantes têm de despertar a ira da montanha chamada Alzangate, caso um projeto de mineração se estabeleça na Cordilheira Andina, da qual ela faz parte, né? Isso é pegando o trabalho da Marisol de la Cadena, né? Medo esse que nós ocidentais não conseguimos sentir ou entender, por mais esforço que possamos fazer, né? Nesses casos, o que geralmente entra em cena, diz a Stangers, é a tolerância. Podemos até aceitar que essa causa seja importante para eles, mas nós permanecemos livres de qualquer vínculo. É isso que leva Stangers a dizer que, mais do que uma questão de conhecimento ou representação, na ontologia política, a ontologia se torna uma questão de compromisso, né? De engajamento com e por um mundo, ou mais precisamente por um mundo onde caibam muitos mundos. Comprometer, Vou fazer isso, tá? Comprometer vem do latim compromittere, né? Significa ajustar ou resolver por meio de concessões mútuas. Essa promessa de mutualidade talvez seja o maior desafio da política ontológica, pois sem ela, a reivindicação de pluralismo pode se transformar em uma simples boa vontade, como diz Stangers, né? Manifestada na demanda abstrata por respeito a outros modos de vida. Malcolm Ferdinand chama isso de simpatia sem vínculo, né? Essa demonstração inofensiva de solidariedade. Com isso, é claro, não proponho que renunciemos ao respeito. Mas se houver apenas respeito, as diferenças podem ser tratadas como incomensuráveis, o que nos faria perder a oportunidade de pensar diante delas e, assim, abrir espaço para que as lutas vitais de outros povos também se tornem nossas, né? A gente pode falar um pouco sobre essa questão da incomensurabilidade, né? Que isso é interessante. A diplomacia, portanto, se torna a condição da coexistência dos diversos mundos. O meio de produzir comensurabilidade, ainda que comensurabilidades, né, instáveis, provisórias, ou mesmo não perfeitas, né, por meio de acordos que efetivamente obriguem as partes umas às outras. No entanto, tampouco seria o caso de adotar a cosmologia do outro, né? Segundo Viveiro de Castro, isso significaria apenas, e eu cito, inverter a nossa pulsão missionária irrefreável, né? Se não se trata mais de fazer os outros pensarem como nós, então devemos nós pensar como eles. Fim da citação. Em vez disso, o que devemos fazer é pensar com eles, e aí eu cito novamente, levar em suma seu pensamento a sério, a diferença de seu pensamento a sério. É apenas pela acolhida integral dessa diferença e dessas singularidades que se poderá imaginar, construir, talvez, o comum. Fim da citação. Assim, a ontologia se torna verdadeiramente uma questão de compromisso quando fazemos dela uma ferramenta para a construção desse comum, entendido como uma possível unidade alicerçada na multiplicidade, um comum que não é o mesmo. Talvez, como Marisol de Lacadena e Mário Blaser dizem, um incomum, né? E aí, por isso que eu falei que é interessante pensar esse papel da comensurabilidade e a incomensurabilidade nessas possíveis, né, conexões, né, parciais. Assim, retomando o slogan zapatista, a ontologia como compromisso diz respeito não apenas à multiplicidade de mundos, mas também à unidade que encapsula tal multiplicidade, por um mundo onde caibam muitos mundos. A ênfase nesse mundo comum que emerge do reconhecimento da interdependência entre os diversos mundos. Né? No que resta da minha fala, então, eu tentarei especificar um sentido de mundo capaz de abrir espaço para a admissão da interdependência. Eu vou tentar precisar melhor os contornos desse global, entendido como possibilidade de construção de incomum, né? E indicar algumas disposições afetivas, talvez, por falta de melhor palavra, que podem auxiliar na assunção desse compromisso da ontologia política, da política ontológica, né? No artigo O Fim do Mundo e Suas Pedagogias, né, tem tradução para o português, a pesquisadora e artista Patricia Reed afirma que, e aí eu cito a Patricia, né, o mundo é composto por conteúdos, pela identificação desses conteúdos e pela configuração das relações de conteúdos que se estabelecem dentro dele, em termos semânticos, operacionais e axiológicos. O mundo ganha concretude conforme modos de fazer e dizer afirmam a coerência entre esses três elementos, né, conteúdos, identificação dos conteúdos e relações entre conteúdos. Mas não só. O ganho de consistência de um mundo está vinculado a critérios de habitabilidade, o que significa dizer que um mundo, ou seja, um modo de organizar uma série de conteúdos, identidades e relações, só se mundifica via processos de localização. Há uma relação aí entre modelo e prática, né? Ainda segundo Reed, a resistência de um mundo depende do quanto suas condições de necessidade compelem seus integrantes a afirmar sua configuração na prática, a despeito de quaisquer atitudes dissidentes que possam existir, né? No exemplo que ela dá, é possível ser veementemente contra o capitalismo e ainda assim não poder evitar pagar contas, né? De modo que mundos capazes de suportar e absorver tais fricções são os mais duradouros. Tais condições de necessidade produzem uma percepção de inalterabilidade desse mundo. É por isso que mundos parecem completos, totais ou naturais. Mas todos os mundos podem eventualmente chegar a um fim, devido à inabilidade ou inadequação de uma configuração existente para absorver fricções. Tais fricções podem ser de ordem ontopistêmica, por exemplo, a descoberta ou invenção de novos conteúdos, pode ser normativa ou pode ser axiológica, normativa ou axiológica, ou seja, a reinscrição semântica desses conteúdos ou identidades de conteúdos, ou mesmo sociomaterial, né? Formas de habitação que se mostram inóspitas. Tais condições de necessidade produzem uma percepção de inalterabilidade. Desculpa. Problema no texto aqui. Mas todos os mundos podem, eventualmente, chegar a um fim devido à inadequação de uma configuração existente para absorver fricções. Quando reconhecemos o limiar induzido por fricções insuperáveis, que germinam dentro de um mundo, conseguimos vislumbrar sua incompletude e a possibilidade, se não de seu fim, ao menos de sua reconfiguração. É nesse ponto que parecemos estar hoje, quando constatamos a incongruência entre as práticas euromodernas de globalização e aquilo que muitos têm chamado de planetário, né? Um modelo teórico que explica como a habitabilidade da Terra foi sendo esculpida ao longo de milhões até bilhões de anos por meio da interação entre processos físicos, químicos e biológicos, os quais precisarão ser levados em conta nos modos de habitação dos terrestres humanos. Então, estamos perplexos e atordoados, todos, porque ainda não sabemos como modificar esse planetário, como fazer essa integração, né? E de forma a respeitar a pluralidade ontológica, né? Não tomar como garantida, como única, a verdade enunciada pela ciência ocidental, né? Reed afirma, então, que os modos de habitação globalizados se caracterizam por tendências monodimensionais. Uma única métrica para medir valor, um modelo único de comportamento humano, proliferação de monoculturas agrícolas, monoculturas de pensamento, o Oliver falou um pouco sobre isso também, privilégio de uma única geografia da razão. Direcionados à eliminação do diverso, tais modos de habitação vêm adotando um modelo de expansividade baseado em um tornar pequeno. A eliminação da diversidade também faz com que se desconsidere o poder das fricções de produzir visões de fora, as quais permitiriam reconhecer a incompletude do mundo. Sintoma disso é achar que estamos completamente submetidos à lógica capitalista, né? No sentido de que não há mais saída, né? Isso leva a autor a sugerir que, eu cito, as lutas por outros mundos exigem um compromisso especulativo mínimo com a incompletude de todos os mundos, que seja possível configurar diferentemente a coexistência. Isso eu acho que conversa um pouco com a pergunta sobre dialética, né? A incompletude de todos os mundos, né? Para Reed, o planetário é um chamado a compor um diagrama espacial multidimensional capaz de acomodar a multiplicação exponencial de relações entre diversas entidades, temporalidades, químicas e materiais. A habitação planetária deve priorizar um espessamento, thickness, né, estrutural, né? O espaço do problema muda de questões de onde as coisas estão para como as coisas hang together, né? A ênfase passa do paradigma da existência para o da coexistência. Não sei se eu já passei. Como é que eu estou de tempo? Está indo, né? Tá. É nessa chave que podemos ler também a ontologia da Terra que o filósofo francês Patrice Manillier vem desenvolvendo. Talvez seja mais preciso dizer que se trata menos de uma teoria sobre a Terra em si, ou em geral, que sobre a Terra pensada como uma entidade global, isto é, quando ela se mostra capaz de reconfigurar a distribuição espacial dos terrestres, o modo de existência seu que nos era desconhecido antes do advento do antropoceno. Porque depois enfim, antropologia, né, depois de tudo que a gente viveu na discussão pós-68, né, o universal começou a se tornar uma categoria bastante suspeita em termos de reivindicação. Né? Então, foi mais claro, né, enfim, sem dúvida o que eu estou fazendo aqui de volta é trazer um outro tipo de universal. Né? E a crise ecológica também, como, sei lá, se a gente seguiu de pé Chakrabarty, né, ela coloca de volta o universal negativo. O universal não foi embora, de forma alguma, né? Mas a gente tinha um pouco de vergonha de falar depois, né, de todas as reivindicações, né, de autonomia ontológica, a gente tinha um pouco de vergonha de tentar trazer de volta essa questão do universal. Né? Então, a ideia era reabilitar o universal em outros modos, né? Pensar, na verdade, outros modos de relacionar universal e particular. Né?
Muito obrigado, Aline. Genial, adorei a sua fala. Na verdade, eu podia até deixar a pergunta para o final, porque acho que faz conexões com o que o Oliva falou, mas eu acho que aí é mais diretamente, de fato, com a sua fala, a questão da interdependência desses diferentes mundos. Tem uma coisa que o Chakrabarty fala, que de fato eu não concordo, mas que eu acho que tem algo aí para ser, de fato, discutido. Quando perguntamos a ele, como lidar com esses diferentes mundos, de fato, com essas diferentes ontologias, etc., por que essa aposta de um planetário construído unicamente sobre a base da ciência, que é o que ele faz? Uhum. E a resposta dele é uma questão de escala. Uhum. Que esses diferentes mundos não têm a escala para responder às questões que... Por isso que até numa das respostas do Oliva ele mencionou o tema da escala. A minha pergunta a você seria essa ideia da interdependência dos diferentes mundos. Como você vê essa interdependência, já que são diferentes mundos com diferentes escalas, com diferentes possibilidades de intervenção, até pelas suas próprias existências, são existências localizadas em contextos específicos, etc. Eles não têm essa ambição, esse claim de falar do planetário, ainda que possam falar, ou seja, Copenau é planetário, mas de alguma maneira não está formulado como um pensamento planetário. No fundo, a minha pergunta seria o seguinte: como lidar com as desigualdades, com as assimetrias de poder desses diferentes mundos na sua ideia de interdependência? É uma interdependência, digamos, horizontal, onde todos têm o mesmo lugar de poder, ou como você lida com essas diferentes possibilidades de intervenção que esses diferentes mundos contêm?
Ótima pergunta, super difícil, assim, de supetão. Vou começar então pela parte do Chakrabarty, né, que eu acho que é mais simples. O de pé Chakrabarty, esse historiador, que tem um trabalho seminal, né, nessas discussões das humanidades ambientais, recentemente publicou um artigo, né, sobre a questão do planetário, na qual se antes ele falava muito da questão da noção de espécie, que seria esse universal negativo, né, o planetário se torna esse universal negativo. Mas o Chakrabarty está falando ali, ainda foi muito criticado por antropólogos, sobretudo, né, porque a ideia do planeta para o Chakrabarty se torna o inumano por excelência, que vai passar a organizar a política humana. Né? Então ele precisa dessa categoria do inumano, não é à toa que muitas pessoas do realismo especulativo vão seguindo essa linha aí, né, do Chakrabarty, em que o planeta se torna então aquilo com o qual não se pode negociar, com o qual, né, que vai exigir. Né? Então, a questão da escala seria ela seria aquela que coloca o planeta como principal categoria do pensamento humanista, né? Ultimamente. Se a gente segue, por exemplo, né, esses autores que eu trouxe aqui, a Patricia Reed ou o próprio Patrice Manillet, a escala é deslocada. Né? O planetário vai se tornar uma demanda, talvez, ou uma imagem do tipo de abertura espaço-temporal que precisa ser considerada para a pensão antropocena, mas também levando a sério modos de outras cosmologias também pensarem essa relação espaço-temporal. Então, o planetário não fica só uma representação da ciência moderna. Né? Então, um pouco a ideia de interdependência seria essa... tentando pensar junto, né? Se eu já tivesse conseguido formular melhor, eu tinha te dado uma resposta mais curta. Dei essa volta para pensar junto. Mas eu acho que, então, a ideia de interdependência demandaria reenquadrar essa escala que é tomada como a principal dentro de circunscrevê-la dentro da perspectiva moderna e, a partir daí, ser capaz de comparar outros modos, né? Por exemplo, quando Copenau fala da Terra inteira, né? Urihipata, né? Tem um outro tipo de planetário que está em jogo aí. Então, a gente pode criar categorias para fazer essas comparações, para justamente não permitir que esse argumento da escalabilidade seja o argumento que vai, de novo, trazer de volta, né, uma unicidade de resposta à crise ecológica, né? Essa outra pergunta era sobre... Era isso, tá. É isso.
Aline, obrigado. Brilhante a apresentação, uma clareza assim, para falar de temas muito complexos, né? Essa interdependência dos mundos, ela pressupõe assim, uma possibilidade de negociação constante entre os mundos. Mas isso já é acho que uma hipótese bastante otimista, porque na verdade há uma violência o tempo inteiro entre esses muitos mundos. É quase uma continuação da pergunta do Sérgio.
Acho que eu não respondi.
Se a gente pensa, o extrativismo não é um tipo de ontologia política também e que depende, que extrai desses outros mundos. Como nessa interdependência entra essa violência, esse desejo de anulação dos outros mundos? Acho que você foi falando sobre isso, né? Falando desse adensamento, desse thinning dos mundos. Né? Queria te ouvir mais sobre esse outro lado. Né?
Que era a parte que eu queria também te responder, tinha esquecido. Na fala do Oliver, ele falou sobre, né, que a modernidade seria formada por diferentes formações cosmológicas, né, o racionalismo sendo a dominante. Então, que a cosmologia moderna, esse racionalismo, nada mais seria do que uma estrutura conceitual para informar a grande política. E quando ele falou isso, me veio à cabeça uma definição que eu gosto muito da Isabelle Stengers, em que ela diz que o Ocidente não é o mundo. O Ocidente é uma máquina de destruir o mundo. Né? Que tem a ver com então, essa pergunta. Né? E estamos ainda para descobrir o que o Ocidente, pensado em torno das suas práticas, né? O que ele pode vir a ser. Então, eu tendo a achar que toda essa aposta especulativa, justamente, essa é uma filosofia especulativa, em falar em adensamento de mundo, né? Em falar em modos de realmente criar mundos que tenham sentido e que tenham, né, complexidade ontológica, complexidade de relações, passa um pouco por essa tentativa de desorganizar essa certeza que, se por um lado é verdade, é profundamente verdade, né? Que essas máquinas de destruir mundo estão se impondo e destruindo outros mundos, né? Alguma coisa tem que ser feita para desarticulá-las. Alguma coisa, né? E do campo da filosofia especulativa, do pensamento, eles acham que é por aí. É jogando luz, né, na complexidade e apostando na possibilidade de construção de laços de interesse. É artificial mesmo, né? Construir essa sensação de que a gente precisa desses outros mundos para a gente continuar vivendo. Né? De que fazer perceber de que esses mundos que parecem completos, totais, fechados, não são. Né? De que para que a gente tenha Terra, planeta do IPCC, a gente precisa da Terra, planeta Urihe. Né? Então, um pouco essa aposta que a gente pode discutir, né, assim, se politicamente ela é suficiente, né, mas que acho que especulativamente ela tem um papel muito, muito importante. Né?
Então, vamos prosseguir agora para a última fala. Eu apresento, então, o professor Thomas Kuhana, uma figura destacada da filosofia contemporânea alemã. Thomas é professor professor de antropologia filosófica e filosofia da mente na Universidade de Potsdam, na Alemanha, onde também dirige o Centro de Filosofia Pós-Kantiana desde 2021. Com uma trajetória internacional, lecionou em instituições como Yale, Essex, Leipzig, Goethe-Universität Frankfurt. A sua pesquisa abrange filosofia social e política, estética, antropologia filosófica e teoria crítica, com foco em Kant, Hegel, Marx. Entre suas obras destaco Das Leben der Freiheit, Form und Wirklichkeit der Autonomie, no qual analisa a forma e a realidade da autonomia, e o aguardado The Life for Freedom in Kant and Hegel, a vida da liberdade, forma e realidade... Eu misturei as informações, desculpa. Então, o aguardado livro The Life of Freedom in Kant and Hegel, em preparação pela Cambridge University Press. Né? É isso, eu passo a palavra, então.
Okay, can you hear me? Thanks first to all the organizers and all the institutions that are participating in this event. It's a real. I'm really grateful to the organizers for having created this opportunity for exchange. It's really wonderful to be here and to be at the University of Sao Paulo. And I'm really looking forward already to the discussion because I think there are lots of points of contact between the first two presentations and my own. I think mine is a little bit too long, so I'm gonna read it quickly. Okay, that's not the best. That's not the best solution to the problem, I know, but it's the only one available to me right now. Okay. So, in what follows, I want to present the outlines, the first outlines of a current project of mine on the politics of nature. Put differently, I want to explore what consequences we need to draw for our basic understanding of the political, or what the political is in the first place, if we want to acknowledge that we have entered the Anthropocene. I know there are many questions about that term, but let's just keep it as an umbrella term for the situation we're in, have entered the Anthropocene and are in the process of undermining our chances to exist in Holocene-like conditions for the foreseeable future. So, of course, obviously, if that's the case, if that's the situation we're in, there's a great need for vigilant political action, for activism, for changing what we are doing, and I don't want to doubt that. But I think it might. This doesn't exclude that it might also be necessary for us to question the very ontology of the political that we have, and because of the question whether the kind of understanding we have of what the political is and how to distinguish it or relate it to the natural might have contributed to the problems we're in. So I will proceed in 4 steps. First, I want to distinguish three historical paradigms of the relationship between nature and politics. First, the distinction between oikos and polis, known to all of you from ancient political thought. Secondly, the distinction between the state of nature and a civic state, which informed early modern political philosophy. And thirdly, the model of political economy, or biopolitics, we might say, which has characterized modernity to the present day. In the 4th step, I want to take stock and then take stock of why none of the paradigms that I will just very briefly outline seem sufficiently attuned to the political significance of non-human nature. The most remarkable for our purposes is, I think, the model of political economy, or biopolitics, which confronts us with a paradox of naturalization. The naturalization of the political, which political economy pursues, has not promoted a sustainable relationship to nature in modern societies, but on the contrary has fueled the current crisis. And I think I just want to bring out this paradox and think about what the consequences are. Against the background of this paradox, I will outline just not really the contours of, but just the desideratum of the need that we have for a different understanding of the political, which can be placed under the general heading of a political ecology, a term that was already brought up in the last presentation. So let me start with the first paradigm, oikos and polis. So the 3 paradigms I will present in the following all reveal a double trait in the relationship of nature and politics, and I'm interested in how this double relationship is to be understood and how it changes through those paradigms. On the one hand, in the tradition of political thought, the political is initially determined by its separation from or opposition to a natural form of human sociality and by an externalization of non-human nature. At the same time, and that's the other side of this double trait, the political is understood in such a way that it rests in one way or another on this natural sociality and structurally depends upon at least some of the externalized natural infrastructures. The first 2 paradigms of the political, which I will briefly outline, represent 2 opposing models, we could say, for thinking this relationship of opposition and foundation between nature and politics. Aristotle famously begins his treatise on the political by stating that those who believe that the family and the state differ only in size are fundamentally mistaken. They differ in the nature of their union and the guiding purpose of their social nexus. This is of significance for our question because the contrast between the family and the state, for Aristotle, is the contrast between a natural and a genuinely political form of community. The origin of the family is its original moving end is the reproduction of the natural life of the beings united in it. For this purpose, a natural social connection arises, first between man and woman, then between those who are by nature destined to rule and those who are by nature destined to be slaves, and finally between parents and children. The natural character of the social bond can be seen particularly clearly in the union of man and woman. According to Aristotle, the union of man and woman occurs, and I quote him, for the purpose of procreation, and it does so, and that's even more important, it does so not by virtue of free choice, but, I quote him, because in common with other animals and with plants, human beings have a natural desire to leave behind them an image of themselves. So what drives this connection is a natural desire or natural drive. The three types of relationships that are entered into for the sake of reproducing natural life are all characterized by relationship of natural inequality. While the relationship of master and slave is characterized by Aristotle as despotic and in sharp contrast to the equality characteristic of a political relationship, the relationship of husband and wife as well as of parent and child are also remain marked by an irreducible inequality that distinguishes them from a genuinely political relationship, which is one between free and equal persons. From a genetic point of view, there is a continuity between the natural community of the families and the political community of the state, insofar as the latter, so the political community, emerges from the former. Families give rise to village communities, and these in turn give rise to a state that encompasses them all. However, this does not change the fact that there is a fundamental distinction in the purpose and nature of the social connection. So there's this genetic continuity, but in the very nature of the connection, there's a discontinuity. Even if the state may originally have come into being for the sake of survival, thus originating in the bare needs of life, as Aristotle puts it, the state continues to exist for the sake of the good or perfect life. So somehow accidentally a state arose because we wanted to survive, but once it's in existence, it continues to exist for something else, not for survival, but for the good life or perfect life. While the target of the household is thus natural life, the human zoe, the object of the political community is bios. It is concerned with the constitution and continuation of a humanly formed life, oriented not towards mere survival, but towards a certain normative notion of a good life. The question of the state thus never is how can we survive, but always how do we want to or are we to live together. In a sense, it presupposes that the first question is already answered. In order to determine, and so it's not clear anymore that this is actually the case, that this question is being answered in an appropriate manner. The question of so in a sense, it presupposes that this question is answered, and in order to determine and to bring out a normatively structured good social life, the members of the state do not unite along natural inequalities, but on the basis of their political equality, their equal entitlement and authority in the determination of what a shared good life could be. This reliance on equality does not mean, of course, that the state would be free of domination, but domination here is not the one-sided domination over the unequal and the unfree, but, I quote Aristotle, government of freemen and equals. All the ruled could by right be rulers too, and this is documented in the fact that political rule ideally includes the change of roles of rulers and ruled. A genuinely political community thus gains its determination through its contrast to the natural community of the oikos. Hannah Arendt even says through its pronounced opposition to it. So it's as if there's a certain war going on between the state and the family in terms of just the nature they have. In genetic terms, it is certainly connected to nature, since politics, as Aristotle explicitly emphasizes, and I quote him, does not produce human beings but takes them over from nature. So in a certain sense, we could say a state cannot provide for itself. Yeah? So nature has to provide these beings, natural beings, that we can take and then do something else with. So it presupposes this natural community. But Aristotle does not problem, and that's interesting, he does not make it a problem that this condition exists, and he does not characterize it as a precarious provision. And he doesn't make it our political task to make sure that this thing remains in place. This applies not only to human beings being produced, and raised in the family, but even more so to the natural basis of households. The existence of the non-human natural resources that are necessary for the reproduction of life in households. These resources must be available, and I quote Aristotle, by nature, since it is the task of nature to provide nourishment for its creatures. So if nature produces us, it has to take care of us. Yeah? So that's nothing that the political would need to discuss. So of course, Aristotle has certain considerations where this comes up, but ideally understanding what the nature of the political is, this question of survival should not be our job, should not be our concern. Of course, I know that's very rough, but it's just in order to get this in front of our eyes, the basic outlines of this paradigms. Let me now come to this second paradigm, state of nature and civic nature. And this has foundational character for political philosophy of the early modern period. This distinction also distinguishes a natural form of sociality from a genuinely political form of sociality, but not through the contrast of the natural community of the family and the political community of the state, but rather through the distinction between two states or conditions of human existence, the state of nature on the one hand and the social condition or civic state on the other hand. The distinction functions again in a double way by virtue of oppositional determination and a genetic connection. In order to determine the genuine form of political sociality, we must interpret it in contrast to a natural form of sociality, so the state of nature. At the same time, a genetic connection is established. The civic state, or the social condition, emerges from the state of nature, and it does so for internal reasons, either because the state of nature itself is untenable, or because the normative order of the state of nature is provisional and must be secured by entering into a civic state. So first alternative is broadly the Hobbesian, the second one is the Kantian. Let me briefly just outline the first model, Hobbes. What is the purpose and nature of the social connection in the state of nature? The highest good is, for Hobbes, self-preservation. And from this arises the natural right of everyone to do whatever is necessary to secure their self-preservation. Not only in this right, but also in their general abilities, the inhabitants of the state of nature are generally equal. However, this very equality does not result in a natural harmony and in a form of natural harmony, but on the contrary, in a fundamental instability of the state of nature. Equality of ability results in the equality of hope in pursuit of our intentions. And I quote Hobbes, "If any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. And in the way of their end, which is principally their own conservation and sometimes their delectation only, endeavor to destroy or subdue one another." So in consequence of this end, there follows this endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. Under conditions of scarcity, equality of ability and equal hope of achieving one's own intentions results in the relentless competition and constant mistrust and constant readiness to fight, and thus the famous war of all against all that we all know. A war that does not have to mean manifest battles, but is in the minimal sense just any, and I quote Hobbes, any tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. So he has an economic definition of war here, you could say, or a weak one. The state of nature is thus constructed by Hobbes in such a way that it is at odds with itself, and I think this is interesting. The way in which we try to achieve self-preservation jeopardizes that very self-preservation. The exercise of our natural right leads to its own annihilation. Note the abstract parallel with the current situation. The exercise of our civil liberties brings about a situation which undermines the possibility of exercising civil liberties in the future. That's why we could say, in this civil state in which we exist, we haven't even exited the natural condition or the state of nature. Latour says this in passing. It is precisely with this self-undermining tendency that leads to a duty of peace arising in the state of nature itself and a duty to voluntarily renounce one's right to everything. However, neither of these, so this duty to peace and this duty to renounce our right, neither of these can be guaranteed without a central coercive power, which is why the laws of nature rooted in the state of nature itself lead us to enter into a civil state or civic or social condition that is constituted by the artificial production of a general power to which all are subject. Whereas for Aristotle, natural sociality was determined by natural inequalities, for Hobbes it's the other way around. The state of nature is a state of radical radical equality, albeit it's a self-extinguishing one. And while the genuine political sociality for Aristotle, for Aristotle's polis is a realm of freedom and equality, Hobbes' civic state is on the contrary a state of radical inequality between sovereign and subject. If there is still equality at all here, it is only the equality of equal subjection or subjugation to the sovereign. In the distinction between the state of nature and the civic state, there's again a genetic dependency and at the same time a logical separation of natural and political sociality. Hobbes intensifies both the continuity and the opposition. The continuity is more far-reaching, and so far the highest good of the social condition is none other than the highest good of the state of nature, self-preservation. So it's only about survival. So there is no good life might be an intensive or a maximized form of survival, but it's nothing qualitatively different like it is in Aristotle. The opposition, on the other hand, is intensified insofar as in the state of nature and the civic state, the state of nature and the civic state are not two species of the same genus. We are not confronted with two different modes of social order, but rather with a fundamental opposition between war and order, or anomy and order. The deeper reason for this sharper opposition lies in the fact that, according to Hobbes, there is no natural agreement in the case of humans at all, as there is in the case of other living beings. Any form of genuine social order can only be artificial in the case of humans. So to call the natural state form of order is kind of a paradoxical or a strange way of use for Hobbes. Finally now, as in the Aristotle paradigm, the dependence of both natural and political sociality on non-human nature is of no greater significance to Hobbes' treatise. The resources necessary to ensure self-preservation are, as Hobbes says, either freely given to man by God, or they are sold to us by him in exchange for our labor. The resources lie either in plain sight or just beneath the earth's surface, so that they can be obtained with some labor or industry. The problem of self-preservation in this sense has nothing to do with the scarcity or unreliability of natural resources, but arises only from man's lack of the natural social coordination and the competition, distrust, and glory-seeking that accompanying it. So we are all used to the idea that Hobbes has put such emphasis on survival, and that survival and the problem of survival has moved us toward entering a social condition and building a state. That's true. But interestingly, for Hobbes, the problem is not so much about the availability of those natural resources that we need in order to ensure survival, but the problem is created by our lack of social coordination, and that's the problem we need to solve. The question of natural resources in itself doesn't really interest him. He suggests, well, God has provided for them. Just like Aristotle said, nature created us and nature has to provide for its creatures, so that job has to be taken over by someone else. And so that's a strange kind of parallel between Aristotle, or similarity between the two. So now let me enter the third paradigm, which is the one I think we are still enmeshed in. Political economy, you could call it, but also biopolitics. This, up until now, I have just recalled two classical paradigms that can certainly be regarded as classical and show how the political was conceived through its contrast to the natural and a certain externalization of non-human nature. In Aristotle, this was the case in that a good life among equals and freemen in the polis was made possible on the basis of a reproduction of natural life ensured by the oikos. In Hobbes, this was true in the sense that the precarious character of people's natural life is overcome by entering the civic state. In both cases, political life is fundamentally different from natural life or life in the state of nature. The embedding of people's natural life in the nature that surrounds and underpins it does not play a defining role for the political in either case. However, this now changes with the third paradigm, and that's why it's so interesting for us or for our purposes. In order to get a handle on it, I will lean on Foucault's analysis of biopolitics and governmentality. This paradigm aims at a double transgression of the Aristotelian as well as the Hobbesian paradigm. For a long time, according to Foucault, and I quote him, man remained what he was for Aristotle, a living animal with the additional capacity for a political existence. Modern man, however, is an animal in whose politics his life as a living being is at stake. So that's Foucault's famous definition of biopolitics from Sexuality, History of Sexuality, Volume 1. In this sense, the essential object of the political in modernity is the formation, development, and government of the living forces of man himself, not the formation of a sphere in which he can develop a genuinely different form of existence that is dependent on being relieved of the needs of his natural reproduction. At the same time, this means that the form of the political is conceived differently. This is not, as with Hobbes, a regime of sovereignty that transforms natural human beings into legally subjugated subjects, but rather a form of what Foucault called government. And I quote him, "There is not nature and then, above nature, against it, the sovereign and the relationship of obedience that is owed to him. We have a population whose nature is such that the sovereign must deploy reflected procedures of government within this nature, with the help of it and with regard to it." Quote end. The normative evaluation of this government is not developed from the point of view of its legitimacy or illegitimacy by relating the intervention of the government to the natural rights of the subjects. Rather, the government is normatively qualified by way of assessing the success or failure with which it promotes the subjects' living forces and satisfies their interests. The interventions of government are in this sense reflected on the level of their natural effects, understood as natural operations that have their reality in the effects they exert upon a natural life of the citizens. Political economy thus understands itself as an empirical science of governance. It must observe and study political interventions in terms of operations situated on a natural plane. It needs to observe the effectivity of these interventions in order to arrive at a conception of good governance. Political economy cannot arrive at this idea of good governance based on predetermined normative idea of what good, proper, justified kinds of political interventions are. This government of the living, which Foucault characterizes in his various lectures on biopolitics, and governmentality, and political economy, operates on three basic levels. Firstly, the interventions aims at the cultivation of the bodies of their subjects. Secondly, they operate as a biopolitics of population. And thirdly, government operates as a political economy of subjective interests. Through these three levels, the living forces of human beings are first built, trained and cultivated, that's the first level. Secondly, these living forces are secured as a whole against their biological endangerment. And thirdly, they are managed, steered and economized by virtue of competitive structures that allow for their enhancement. So we build the living forces, we secure them, and then we do economy with them, right? We exhaust them or exploit them. The intervention on all three levels are understood on the model of a productive type of power that does not aim per se at restriction, containment, or sanction, but rather intervenes in order to enable, promote, increase what is regulated in this way. The form of regulation is not through laws that demand obedience and sanctions, but through flexible norms that aim to dynamically normalize the subjected. This form of promotional intervention, which does not seek to pursue directive standardization, corresponds to the format of indirect control. Political intervention operates essentially by changing the milieu or the environment, by determining formal context conditions in which and through which the living forces of individuals unfold in a certain way and in a certain direction. So the exemplary paradigm of this is the idea of a market. So you determine conditions, market conditions, environmental conditions for individual agents. You don't tell individual agents what to do, what to prefer, what to pursue, but you create conditions for them, environmental conditions that will steer their behavior in a way that allows you to enhance the living forces to maximize the outcome. And so this idea of an invisible hand that Smith has is this kind of central metaphor that you use. The purpose of political connection is thus the promotion, enhancement, and utilization of natural life. The nature of social connection has a twofold form. On the one hand, it consists in the collective existence of all as part of a common population, which as a population is the object of political concern. On the other hand, it lies in an equality of competition secured and regulated by the political, which as such should simultaneously enable the maximization of the common good. If we follow Foucault and define politics in such a way, in such a way that it is directed towards the promotion of natural life and characterizes political operations themselves as quasi-natural operations, then this initially gives the appearance of a complete transformation of the concept of the political. The difference between natural and political sociality that had been constituted of the political in both antiquity and in Hobbes is abandoned. So there's no sharp distinction between the political and the natural, it seems. Yeah? If this were true, however, the question arises as to why there is and must still be politics at all, even if only in the transformed form of government. Hobbes had put forward the interesting thesis that while in social animals the pursuit of the private good also promotes the common good, due to natural social coordination, this is precisely not the case with humans. So Hobbes, the arch-father of liberalism, told us that's not the case. So nature hasn't created things such that for us to pursue our own individual good will bring about the common good. Not true. The subtle efforts of political economy show that even if political economy does not always admit this Hobbesian insight, it actually shares the notion. It obviously assumes that the living powers of man do not reach their full development if just left alone. Rather, a policy of cultivation by political care for the population and constitution of marketed competition is needed in order to make sure of that. All of this suggests that for political economy too, human nature requires a form of development, of cultivation, protection and management that makes government indispensable. Politics thus proves to be the operator of the good naturalization of man. Yeah? It's a naturalized picture of the political, but there's a good way of naturalizing us. Yeah? Naturalization is itself a political project. The promotion of this nature within the particular limits and weaknesses that it exhibits, and the cunning use of this nature. Okay, so I left the brackets out, and so I'm in that middle paragraph. Yeah, my microphone loses its balance. Okay, so now to the next paragraph. Insofar as political economy regards the modulation of the environment and the milieu as a particularly suitable method of control, political economy even borrows an ecological, quasi-natural model to think of what politics should be like. However, it is still implemented as a technique of government that can only achieve the desired effect through the artificial construction of its milieu. The milieu of bourgeois society or civil society is an artificially created nature, a second nature, if you will. And even the influence exerted by this milieu takes a detour via the decisions of the subject. The fact that the subject of interest is not measured against the moral idea of desirable aspirations, but is accepted in the facticity of its aspirations and interests, and the fact that the pursuit of these interests is simply licensed and given free roam through a certain legal form, does not change the fact that the subject is addressed as one that has to make free and inalienable decisions. We can therefore conclude that the biopolitics and that this paradigm of biopolitics and political economy present themselves as more naturalistic than they are. They insufficiently acknowledge the political, strategic, artificial character of the naturalization they pursue. And with that, I come to the fourth and concluding sections, which is very short. Considering the predicament of the Anthropocene now, the third paradigm of the political may initially appear as very promising and attractive, as it breaks with the externalization of nature and profoundly naturalizes the political itself. And I think that's interesting. I want to take seriously how interesting a move it is, this third paradigm. The paradigm aims at the natural life itself of the human being. So it does not start by saying human beings have a life that is a political life that is to be distinguished from the natural life that other natural creatures have. We just have a natural life that can be intensified and enhanced and developed, right? And so the political is just about this enhancement, the development of our natural life. And it aims to exert control now through ecological modification. It uses responsive mechanisms of control that are oriented towards their own success or failure and do not expect normative and dogmatic adherence to guidelines in a way that is unwilling to learn. So we don't say the political is the realm of the normative. No other natural being has such a thing. And we should do what we should do and follow what the norms tell us to. No, let's try things out and see how they play out. And if they play out in the right kind of way, do more of that. If they don't, do less of that. So it's a learning attitude. It's a scientific attitude even to the world that is able and willing to learn from nature. One might therefore expect that the paradigm of biopolitics or political economy would be particularly suited to opening up routes to a new politics of nature, through which we can politically address the fundamental ecological crisis of the human form of life. On the other hand, it is quite obvious that the massive crisis that endangers our continued existence on this planet grew precisely, that this crisis developed precisely at a time when a biopolitical and political economical understanding of the political prevailed. We are dealing here with what seems to be a paradox. The naturalization of politics goes hand in hand with a form of the political that has brought the human form of life in radical opposition to the natural necessities of its own continued existence. The naturalization of politics has not led to a way of life that is compatible with the natural conditions of human existence, but quite the opposite. Moreover, it seems that this form of politics currently makes it impossible to respond adequately to the situation, despite the now comprehensive knowledge we have of the crisis we are in. So right now it seems that we are making less and less progress, and these paradigms make it impossible to change the situation. How is this possible? Well, just three general points that you can think of. Anthropocentrism. Biopolitics is as anthropocentric as the former political paradigms, in the sense that it focuses on the natural life of humans and does not include non-human nature in its efforts of cultivation, safeguarding, and enhancement. True, it does not say we have an exceptional kind of nature that is nowhere to be found in other parts of nature, but in terms of what kind of life it aims to promote, it's just interested in one sort of life, not the others. So it's not about the cultivation of other forms of life and opening them up to other ways of developing a second nature. Secondly, extractivism. Not only does it leave out non-human nature, except maybe when the immediate state of non-human nature makes the cultivation, safeguarding, and enhancement of human nature impossible, it fundamentally treats non-human nature as a disposable instrument for the enhancement of human life. This becomes clearest in the property regime of political economy, which regards nature as a masterless thing that can be appropriated and following the natural laws of human economy must be appropriated. Political economy thus prescribes and establishes a certain relationship between human and non-human nature without making this relation itself an issue for political determination. And thirdly, depoliticization. This paradigm has a fundamentally, and I think that has something to do with the way in which it now blocks our ability to change the situation. This paradigm has a fundamentally depoliticizing effect through its forms of naturalization and removes the politically created framework conditions that produce the artificial nature of humans from further political scrutiny. All of this suggests that we can only gain a new paradigm of the political that corresponds to the current situation by critically engaging with political economy. So that's the main insight, I guess, of the talk, to say any true kind of political ecology presupposes the critique of political economy. So we are back with Marx, in a sense. In the present, we encounter two fundamental programs of such a political ecology that still seem inadequate to me. And let me just outline those two, and then I'm done. On the one hand, we find an effort to reverse the externalization of nature without, however, abolishing the actual logic of political economy. This paradigm searches for mechanisms that can help internalize the natural costs of human activity appropriately and to reward nature's ecosystem services in an appropriate manner. We all know this in terms of a familiar political program under the heading of green capitalism. To my mind, however, this amounts to the extension of the neoliberal scheme of managing living forces of non-natural nature. It might be politically the best thing we can do right now, so to talk about rights of nature or to put price tags on natural resources that we abuse and that we do not factor into our calculations. To pay for CO2 that we emit might be the best pragmatic thing to do right now in order to make some progress. But what it does in terms of political paradigm, it extends the very paradigm that I think has caused the problem, or is mainly responsible for the problem. Not only are our powers and passions to be promoted and increased, but the forces of nature now are also being included in this management. So the supposedly, and I think it's not really natural, the supposedly natural logic of human political economy is thus extended to the whole of nature. It is obvious that there is no room here for a logic of natural life that is heterogeneous to the logic of political economy. And if this kind of political ecology has something to do with what we heard in the presentation before, a world that makes room for other worlds, then it does not make room for any other worlds, but rather absorbs or appropriates nature in the same manner. On the other hand, this other option, there's a radical counter-proposal which Bruno Latour himself has called political ecology, which undermines the fundamental distinction between the human and the non-human entities and suggests treating them both as actors that can in principle be relevant subjects and objects of political decisions. The proposal ultimately aims to abandon the very notion of nature and makes the seemingly paradoxical proposal to abandon the delimitation of the political by nature as such. Instead of opposing nature and politics, the political must establish a bicameral system, as Latour puts it, the first of which must decide who counts, and the second of which then asks how those that count can coexist. As refreshing as some of Latour's ideas are, to me, it is unclear how to answer the political question of who decides who counts. I think I don't see any solution in Latour for that. Who decides who counts? It remains unclear how the idea constitutive of the political since Aristotle, that those who are subject to the laws also have to be the ones that make them, is to survive this expansion of the parliament to include things. Most importantly, it seems unclear how disregarding any fundamental difference or rift between the logic of social reproduction and the logic of natural reproduction can be helpful in addressing the fundamental crisis of the Anthropocene. In certain respects, I think, both designs have in common that they aim to undermine the difference between nature and politics, but they do so in opposite direction. The liberal political ecology or green capitalism simply generalizes the notion of naturalized politics to include non-human nature as well. So it comes from the side of the political and undermines the division to the natural from that side. Right. Completing the naturalization of politics with this last step of including nature in the political realm. The anti-modern political ecology, on the other hand, resists the notion of naturalization so much so that it questions the natural character of nature itself. Rather than naturalizing society and nature on a shared model, anti-modern political ecology proposes to politicize nature and thereby also to repoliticize society as well. You won't be surprised if I tell you that where my sympathies lie, certainly with the second model. More sympathies. However, I have my doubts with regard to Latour's program as well. Even if the politicization of nature is to prefer to the naturalization of politics, the issue remains that Latour undermines the very distinction I believe we need to analyze the crisis we are in and to explore the ways of getting out of it. So I think we can't give up the distinction. Instead of either economizing our relationship to nature or abolishing the difference between politics and nature, I believe we must politicize the relationship between politics and nature itself. And I think Benjamin has given us, there's one central passage in the Einbahnstraße where he says that's exactly what we need to do. Politicize the relationship between politics and nature. This is what I want to call a dialectical form of political ecology. The path to such a politics of nature leads via a critique of the naturalization of political economy and the repoliticization of the human metabolism with nature. Thanks so much.
Yeah, can you hear me on the? Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. I literally agree with almost everything you said, except the one thing, of course. But I was wondering. I also agree with your criticism on Bruno Latour and similar concepts. But then when you come to your conclusion, you say we must politicize the relations between nature and politics. I think the same problem will arise immediately. Like who is this we? Like what kind of inclusions and exclusions have already happened when we do this operation of self-critique, of returning to political economy, of doing another round of critical digestion and so on. And I think, so in a way, I think all political projects will face this problem. And so to defend it, at least to a certain degree, the Latourian notion, I would say, well, if I understand it right, that his idea of parliament is not a constituted parliament. It's more like the pre-parliament. So everyone gathers and like everyone says what they're interested in. So that is not completely a political solution. I also doubt that. I also think for the problems of our time there is no solution anyway. So there's only like ways of trying to deal with it, so different cultures of trying to deal with it maybe. But yeah, so my question would be like, how would you think, because this concerns the very center of this whole conference also, because I think in the idea that you kind of proposed at the very end, I'm still missing the sort of like a sort of solution to the problem that there is also other we's that already are entertaining other relations to nature that are not compatible with political economy. So I just want to point in this direction of how can we solve this problem of who counts also as a subject of critique.
So if you can also develop further this idea of repoliticized metabolism, just to understand, because it's the very central part of your talk, but you didn't have time for digging further. Thank you.
Okay. Oh yeah, this one. Yes, thank you so much. Yes, I also agree with almost everything that you said. But no, so I agree. I agree with the question. And that's very true. It's very true. And I also want to work in that direction, namely to say that is the very structure of the political, that contestedness and openness of that we. That makes it a political process. That is an unsettled question. And so I didn't want to say I have an easy fix for the problem that Latour does not. But it seemed to me that in the way in which Latour described the problem or described the scenery of this one, the first chamber, it didn't show up in the right way for me, the contestedness of the we or the openness. It seemed to me that in a certain sense he thinks we need to get over this system of the two chambers that we had before between the experts that go out and bring us back the information, and we inside we just have to deal with it. But everyone can now say what matters, but everyone, what he means is every human being can say in that chamber all the things that, no, I know he doesn't mean that, but I mean, all the things can make noises and so on. But in that chamber, what he describes is, he describes the workings of the European Union and what happens in committees. That's what he describes, it seems to me. People bringing up issues and it not being settled, it's unpolitical. And all of this is being potentially to be included. And then once we have included it, then the question arises, how can we coexist? But I just think that he does not address the political nature of this we. So I don't want to say he makes a mistake, but rather he does not bring out the paradox of the situation that you try to bring out as much. And so in that sense, I think you're perfectly right that the way in which I presented it might seem like I have an easy solution or I have solved that problem. I haven't excluded anyone from this. But this is the very plight of the political, that it can never avoid this battle and this contestation of the we. And you're right as well. And I think more to the point with regard to the question of the you were asking about more specifically about the we of the critics. And I think I agree with you that the we of the critics that I have firmly in view, or that I feel comfortable in claiming for myself, speaking as an I for that we, is a very limited community, and that's the question you brought up in your talk, and also you did. And so this kind of world that is more open to other worlds, I'm very much speaking as a high modern, self-criticizing themselves, and that can't be the full perspective on it. Yeah, I agree with that. And you nicely pointed that out.
How about the metabolism?
There was another question about metabolism.
Yes. Yes. Okay. That's a tremendous question. I'm just very interested in the way in which in which Marx tries to, in which this notion plays a big role in Marx in his understanding or critique of political economy, working with this notion of a metabolism and analyzing the kind of situation we're in terms of some kind of a metabolic rift. And what I generally am very interested in is the way in which in Marx's oeuvre this notion is understood in a quite simplistic manner, it seems to me. Namely, it's supposed that there is some kind of a metabolism between man and the human being and nature, and there is some rift created between the two. And but if you look into the notion in Marx more specifically, what Marx actually talks about is the relation between a societal metabolism and a natural metabolism. So it's not, I mean, as a shorthand, he speaks about the metabolism between man and nature, but in analyzing the relation, he's analyzing these two relations between societal metabolism and natural metabolism. And what he's most interested in is in certain things that he calls mediators of those metabolisms. And those mediators are not Stoffwechsel, also the German term is Stoffwechsel, like exchange of matter or stuff, but rather change of form, metamorphosis. Formwechsel is the thing mediating the Stoffwechsel. And the metamorphosis of the commodities, the metamorphosis of the forms of capital are the processes by means of which the Stoffwechsel is being mediated. And only if we get this in view, we get the tools in order to analyze the situation. So I think that there's much more to be worked out in that regard than has already been done. Because, of course, people are very interested in this notion and it's been thrown around a lot, but I think there's much more in Marx and that hasn't been fully acknowledged.
Is it working? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. That was great. And I'm wondering, is it okay to ask a question about, like, interrelated papers now?
That's exactly what we should be doing now.
Good. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm wondering, I think Alina, is that your name, Alina? Introduced some interesting concepts for us, including multiplicity. I know that was in Pluriverse too, but multiplicity and affective dispositions. And I'm just wondering how we might think about those concepts in relationship to your question about politics. There's a way in which, as I'm hearing you, the politics that you're talking about at the end is one side, one politics. They're maybe bicameral, whatever, but there's still one. And I think, Alina's talking about different ways of knowing, different ways of feeling, and how those might come together. Can we have a variety of different politics of a sort? Would that help us? I mean, I'm even thinking about the ways that non-human animals protest. They demonstrate things, right? There's the orcas, when they have children baby cubs that die, they carry them around, in a kind of demonstration of sorts. But Marx also worried about nature pushing back in a certain way, the rest of nature pushing back in the sense of ecological crises that would exceed human ability even to master. So I guess I'm wondering about multiplicity in terms of being something that moves away from the centrality of human mastery. I was going to give this to Bernardo, but I'll give it to the next person.
Thank you. So I have a more specific question for you, Thomas, but I think I can also connect it to a more general question for all of you three panelists. First of all, thank you so much for this overview, different perspectives, really illuminating. But I have a problem with your definition of political economy. Mm-hmm. I think in your answer to Aline addressing Marx, you answered somehow my question, but still, in the paper, at least as you have seen in your presentation, it seems to me that you define political economy as a very specific strain in political economy, but not the whole field of political economy. Mm-hmm. So you are, at least as I got that in your presentation. You're talking much more about liberal or even new liberal political economy. So this sort of attempts to creating modes of governance for predatory capitalism. But this is only, let's say, a few part, even if very important in terms of politics, but it's a small part of the whole thing. What about the let's say, more critical approaches in political economy? Even if you take authors such as Arthur Escobar and also Malcolm Ferdinand, I don't think that you can make this very strict differentiation between political economy and political ecology. So they do somehow both. So therefore, my question to you is how to perhaps understand political economy and also the importance of political economy in providing a diagnosis of extractivist, predatory capitalism. And this is connected to the more general question, because at least as I have understood in the responses given by both Aline but also Oliver to the, let's say, to put in terms of Chakrabarty will be how to connect the global and the planetary, because the global is the space in which institutionalized politics take place. And this politics is about power. It's not about epistemic solutions. And the solutions or the responses you present, especially Aline, with this very fascinating idea of interdependence of different worlds, is for me epistemic response. But if you are dealing with big politics, to use your term, Oliver, so you have to do with an order, let's say, order of factors in which you cannot offer only epistemic answers. You need also answers in terms of power. So therefore, the question will be how to connect this global, the big politics, in which negotiations are relevant for transform the planetary level, how to connect both levels. Yeah.
May I? It's here. May I? Okay. So it's not a very general question, but I'll try to make it a general question, but it's more addressed to Aline. Because it's in your title, there is the idea of mutuality. You talked about interdependence, but at the same time, you talked about the divergence between worlds inside the world. So, and I would like to know more about conflict, which I think it's part of also the other, especially Thomas' last take, and I think it should be. There is a language in going on here, which is sometimes trying to reframe it in terms of mutuality, interdependence, relationality, which is typical of the ontological turn. But at the same time, it generally excludes conflict, divergence, and other kinds of, politically full concepts. So that's the point.
Because it gets too much, I think. Rapidamente, né? Vai ter essa pergunta, a sua, e assim, a gente vai ter que tentar responder o mais rápido possível, porque a gente vai ter que acabar aqui 10, vamos tentar terminar 10 para 1.
Sí. Sí, también una pregunta para Aline. Pensaba como a modernidade constrói a ideia de autoridade, não? Que é como uma ideia oposta à natureza. Por quê? Porque a natureza reconhece autoridades naturais e a política moderna é uma ruptura com isso. Por quê? Porque os que suportam a autoridade são aqueles que prestam consentimento. E isso é claro que é idílico, utópico, mas eu penso que ainda é um desafio para nós, porque pensava nessa ideia de levar a conta de aqueles que não fazem parte da decisão, como se eles fizessem. Bom, para mim, isso é menos desafio que pensar que na construção da autoridade devem estar incluídos todos e disputar quem são esses todos, não? Mas pensava que acho muito mais paternalista levar a conta aqueles que não participam das decisões, não? Isso era.
Bom, primeiro, para todos vocês, excelentes falas, né? Fizeram pensar muito. E, na verdade, o que eu tenho para considerar ou para perguntar complementa um pouco a pergunta de vocês, colegas. Então, um pouco mais voltado para o Oliver e para a Aline, né? É com Y, eu troco, desculpa. Tudo bem. Você buscou fazer uma aproximação com, digamos assim, com a questão da pós-verdade, da questão de seria muito fácil simplesmente só a gente considerar, temos que ensiná-los a saber o certo. E entender que, na verdade, eles operam, né, que é o ponto que eu estudo atualmente, que eles operam dentro de um modo de vida que para eles tem toda a coerência. A gente não tem que ensinar coisa nenhuma, em certo sentido, porque eles estão refratários a isso. Juntando um pouco as duas coisas, então, se é possível pensar em outros mundos compossíveis, tornar-se sensível ao que os outros mundos reclamam, dizem e operam, isso inclui o que o mundo proto do Handmaid's Tale, que essas pessoas advogam, também deve ser levado em conta?
Nada impede que seja.
You said that you had too much things to say, so you should start.
I should start.
Yes.
Well, yeah, obviously we can't really answer all these questions, I think, so I'm just going to just maybe will say something about one point that seems very crucial to me about the current global situation, and I think that the answer, or what I'm going to say, is addressing at least a few of the questions. So I think that it's very tempting to think that because we have global problems, we need global solutions. And that may well be the case, but there is a real problem, I think, if this is a dogmatic, if this is like a dogmatic thesis. So I'm not sure if it's true that there can be a solution of the type of big politics that can solve the problems that we are in. It may be, but it may not be. And the thing is, as soon as we assume that this is certain, there has to be this type, which is a wishful thinking, I think, there has to be this type of big-scale solution and not maybe very partial, small-scale solutions that will not really solve the entire problem, but that may be still the best we got. As soon as we make this sort of dogmatic assumption that there must be this solution because we want it to be there, we want it to exist. This is, I think, a very problematic thing. And as soon as we assume that there must be this solution, we also must assume, well, there must be someone who can find the solution. And then, big surprise, who is the someone who can find the solution? Yeah, well, it's the same subjects that have always created the problem. And I think that this is really a serious problem. So I would say we really need to be first more careful with these assumptions. We need to be more in a dialogical way of thinking that acknowledges that all these problems were created starting from assumptions like these. And as soon as we accept that, well, maybe it is the case that there won't be the one solution. There will be many solutions by many different actors that maybe will never be reunited in one community. As soon as we do that, we will be drawn to a much more careful form of politics, one that doesn't assume that we can fully foresee the effects of all our actions. And I think that's very important because these global solutions to these ideas, they are so incredibly dangerous, and we have no idea what we're doing. Like if these things like trying to
to manipulate the climate and these big-scale solutions. I think they're so dangerous, and literally history has always shown that these things, we don't have them under control. Like, we always think, now we know everything, we can control everything, but we kind of really, in this mindset repeat a lot of the assumptions that you also like laid out in your talk. So I think what's very important is like this dialogical approach that I think you highlighted a lot in your talk, and that automatically leads to a more careful form of politics that is at least more skeptical towards these big-scale solutions. Maybe, I don't know who wants to be next.
As my answer will be in a lot of ways similar to Oliver, speaking Portuguese because I'm much more intelligent in Portuguese. And I can express. Então, concordo com o que o Oliver disse sobre essa... eu acho que o fato de os efeitos da devastação ter esse caráter pervasivo não deveria nos autorizar a que o nosso diagnóstico também tivesse esse diagnóstico de poder e da maneira como a gente estabelece as causas e consequências das relações de poder. A maneira como, por exemplo, nós falamos, né, do capitalismo e das suas consequências pode coincidir de muitas formas com, por exemplo, a análise do Davi Copenau em A Queda do Céu, mas não são feitos nos mesmos termos, não são os mesmos agentes. Né? Então, a ideia, um pouco concordando com o que o Oliver disse, é que a gente não... concordando com o que o Oliver disse e tentando colocar em jogo um entendimento de ontologia, seguindo alguns autores, eu estou pensando aqui sobretudo no Casper Brun-Jensen, a ideia de ontologias práticas. Né? Ontologias fazem... Né? Ontologias também são feitas de discursos e de entendimentos que fazem mundo. Né? Então, um pouco essa disposição afetiva, né? Affective disposition, não significa enfraquecer, desintegrar a política da maneira como a gente entende o efeito coletivo do que precisa fazer, mas permitir que essas outras diagnósticos sobre o que está acontecendo informem a nossa política e a nossa prática, de modo que a gente, na melhor das intenções de resolver um problema, então vamos resolver o problema da crise ecológica fazendo o capitalismo 3.0 na Amazônia. Poderia ser um jeito da gente resolver diante do diagnóstico que a gente tem. Então, essa é uma primeira coisa. Né? Seria um jeito ou outro também, então, de falar de conflitos. Né? Eu falei pouco de conflito, mas a ideia de falar das divergências, não falar só do ponto de vista daqueles que... daqueles que estão... nessa cosmologia que está destruindo os outros mundos. Né? Então, a ideia é de dar uma desacelerada para que esses conflitos também sejam colocados nos termos daqueles que estão sendo... estão também dessa guerra de mundos, né? E para que isso possa, pelo menos, ficar claro. Que o trabalho da Marisol de la Cadena é excelente para isso, né? Para a gente pensar um pouco. Continua falando em poder, está tudo ali. Capitalismo, a Tsing também, né? Está tudo ali. Só que os modos de falar disso não são numa única linguagem de poder, né? Seriam por aí. Né? Eu sei que a minha fala acabou ficando um pouco, talvez, mais... Pelas perguntas, a fala acabou ficando um pouco, mas num registro mais positivo, né? Mas acho que essa era a ideia. Uma última coisa que eu queria responder, então, sobre... Se a cosmopolítica ela seria paternalista, da perspectiva da política moderna, talvez. Né? Mas a questão, o que a Stanger está colocando em circulação, a partir dessa noção de diplomacia, é a responsabilização por mundos que podem vir ao fim, justamente porque as demandas, as exigências do falar político podem não interessar a esses outros que... Né? Então, não se trata de agir por eles, de falar por eles, mas de tentar levar em consideração aquilo que mesmo a sua ausência da arena de discussão possa implicar como consequência. Né? Então, é um exercício, né, não é falar sobre, falar por, né? É falar de um jeito, né, expandido. Né? Por fim, levar em conta os outros mundos. Certamente não precisa considerar. Mas eu acho que se essa conversa vai ter que acontecer, a gente vai ter que entender as razões pelas quais precisam do Handmaid's Tale. Essas razões precisam ser melhor compreendidas do que eu acho que a gente tem se dedicado a fazer. Né? Eu tenho, por exemplo, muita curiosidade para saber por que os terraplanistas precisam que a Terra seja plana. Eu morro de curiosidade para saber, de verdade. Né? Então, não se trataria de... Alguma coisa eles têm ali, e alguma suspeita sobre o modo como... a nossa ciência circula, é produzida, alguma coisa ali eles estão dizendo de importante que a gente deveria ver, né? Enfim, falei pra caramba, mas... Sorry.
Tá bom, tá bom. Tá bem interessante.
Okay, I'm not tempted to ask for the translation of the full reply, but we don't have time for that. We'll do it in the break. Yes. So thanks a lot for all those questions. I thought they were all very, very interesting and pertinent, and right to the connections between the three talks. Just very brief comments. So the first question on the varieties of different types of politics. That makes a lot of sense to me. So I see that in terms of the way in which I approached the question, I was very much trying to work out what is a basic understanding of the basic understanding of the political, and so starting from a very uniform notion in a certain sense and questioning the paradigms that we have. And so therefore I can't really afford of undermining or my first step can be to pluralize the notion, but I agree with you that in the end, this kind of making the relation between nature and politics itself a political question. If that should work, if that's the thing that we do, then this will internally pluralize the political. This must be what it's like. So, in a certain sense, all the three paradigms that I described work with a set understanding of how the relation is to be conceived and want to exclude that from political negotiation. It's the very, very being of the political to be in this relation to the natural and so deal with it. So that's the kind of message. Whereas I say, no, we have to politicize this relation itself. So it's not set in stone, but that's actually our political task. And so therefore I think it's right that ultimately this would need this kind of internal pluralization. Then, with regard to your interesting example, just this one cautionary remark. So I find this very interesting to think about non-natural nature as demonstrating or being engaged in a certain form of political action. But you also brought up this notion of the revenge of nature, yeah. And I'm always worried here that we anthropomorphize nature, and the very problem that I want to bring out is, in a certain sense, and it connects to the question of mutuality and conflict, that I want to make room in our political dealings with the relation to nature. I want to make room for understanding or for acknowledging a fundamental difference that looks like an indifference. So a way for nature to not care about us at all. So the planet at least will continue, I mean, in some sense or form, no matter what we do. And we can't, I mean, there is a certain way of indifference that the natural has to whatever our projects were that we need to take into account. Also in terms of what Oliver said, like our attempt in this situation now to finally control the situation, to be more in control even, and like geoengineer and so on, that completely misses the way in which there's something there that escapes us, escapes our grasp, escapes our, not just our directional way of influencing it, but just takes no note of us in a certain sense. And so this dimension of indifference or radical break, so I think that's something that I would also like to get in. And so with regard to that, the count between mutuality and conflicts is also interesting, because I totally get what you say, this language of mutuality, interdependence, relationality. It's all very neighboring, friendly, right? Harmonious. And so it can be wrong on that part. The political model of conflict then might seem to have advantages. But on the other hand, the way we have thought about conflict in terms of political conflict, it's a conflict between equals. It presupposes a certain kind of unity that only makes this possible, this kind of conflict. So there's something to be said for both models, or wanting in both. And so this kind of, I don't really have the full language yet, but trying to understand these kinds of radical difference, accounting for this kind of radical difference without assimilating it either to an interhuman conflict and assimilating it to some kind of a neighboring harmonious kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's what I'm looking for. And so, but I think that was also very, important comment. And with regard to political economy and political ecology, thanks so much. So I would really love to hear more about this, and we can maybe talk some. I'm not really familiar with the authors you mentioned and how exactly they think about the relation. But I'm clear that what I worked with in terms of political economy was very narrow. So that I understand. But I also want to, and in terms of the fact of the matter, what I wanted to bring out is, if we see even these limited cases of political economy that we are all don't feel very sympathetic to in a certain sense, or see the problems they have, even those on the level of their thinking, it sounds like an attractive kind of idea. It's so close to political ecology. And so I'm also puzzled by the fact, why is it not more like that? Or why why isn't it capable of opening up in this way in which you described or pointed us to? So I think that you're right in pointing out that the paradigm that I had is very narrow. But I'm interested in other ways of thinking about political economy where it would not be opposed to political ecology. Thanks.
Ok, gente, está encerrada a mesa. Muito obrigado. Tentaremos voltar às 2. Shall we say 15 minutes later?
Tá bom.